Hello from Mrs. Rania As-Safadi. English for Palestine, 10th grade. Do you still remember them? Excellent. This is Mr. Fogg. This man is Passepartout. The man who is following them called Detective Fix. The woman who was saved is Oda. They are Around the World in 80 Days story characters. What has happened with them after the General Grant steamship's captain saw them? Did they reach Japan? Did they meet Passepartout? Let's have fun and open our books page 16, Unit 7, Periods 11 and 12.
The Carnatic departed at 6:30 p.m. on November 7th and steamed toward Yokohama, Japan. The ship was completely booked, and only 2 staterooms in the rear were unoccupied, those reserved for Mr. Fogg and Aouda. Shortly after Fix had left Passepartout in the opium den, 2 waiters lifted him to the bed reserved for smokers. 3 hours later, he woke up and fought off the hypnotic influence of the drug. He hurried to the steamer, and when he reached his room on board, immediately passed out. When Passepartout woke up the next morning, he staggered onto the deck, wondering what Mr. Fogg would say.
At least I didn't miss the steamer, which is the most important thing,
he said to himself as he sipped some strong black coffee. Passepartout suddenly thought of Fix and how the man had left him in the tavern.
As for that rascal, I hope we are rid of him,
he said.
A detective on the track of Mr. Fogg accusing my master of robbing the Bank of England. Ridiculous. Mr. Fogg is not a robber.
Passepartout finished his breakfast and then descended to the staterooms. Mr. Fogg and Aouda were nowhere to be found. There was no luggage, nothing. Passepartout wondered if he was even on the right ship. He rushed to the purser and asked,
Am I on the Carnatic?
Yes, on the way to Yokohama,
replied the purser, a little surprised.
May I look the passenger list?
Asked Passepartout.
Of course.
The purser had the list with him and showed Passepartout. When he had read every name, Passepartout fell thunderstruck on a seat. Mr. Fogg and Aouda were not on the passenger list. Now he realized what had happened. The time of departure had changed, and he had been unable to tell Mr. Fogg. Mr. Fogg and Aouda had missed the steamer. Passepartout felt sick to his stomach with rage. He tore at his hair and vowed that if he ever saw Fix again, he would even the score with him indeed. After his anger calmed, Passepartout thought through his situation. It was certainly not an attractive one. He was on the way to Japan with no money. And what was he going to do when he got there? At dawn on November 13th, the Carnatic reached the port of Yokohama. Passepartout went ashore. He had nothing better to do than wander aimlessly through the city. In the crowded streets, he saw all sorts of people. Priests in white robes, police officers with black pointed hats, sailors in blue cotton, and royal guards in stiff armor with long, thin swords on their backs. He also saw beautiful groves, tall sacred gates, bridges hidden in the midst of bamboo, and temples shaded by immense cedar trees. By the next morning, hunger gnawed at Passepartout's empty stomach. With no money, he thought of selling his precious family watch, but changed his mind. He would rather starve first. He decided he could earn some money as a vagabond performer, but then thought he was too well dressed to be believable. After a long search, he found a small shop that bought old clothes. He asked the owner if he could exchange his European clothes for an old Japanese coat and a faded turban he saw in the window. The owner also gave him a few pieces of silver in the trade. Passepartout immediately found a food stand and ate what little breakfast he could afford.
Now,
he thought to himself.
I mustn't lose my head. I must consider how I'm going to feed myself.
He walked toward the docks, having decided that passengers from visiting steamers would be the most generous customers. On the way, he was surprised to see a sign in English. It read, "Japanese acrobats, the long noses. Come and see them before their departure to the United States. Grand attraction." Passepartout was excited. He had been an acrobat in his youth. If he was hired, he could find himself on the way to the United States, exactly where Mr. Fogg was headed. A quarter of an hour later, Passepartout stopped before a large, colorful tent. He entered and asked for the owner of the show. Mr. Battlecar appeared immediately and interviewed Passepartout.
You are pretty strong, eh?
Asked Mr. Battlecar.
Especially after a good meal.
Responded Passepartout.
And can you sing?
Mr. Battlecar asked.
Yes.
Said Passepartout.
But can you sing standing on your head with a top spinning on your left foot and a sword balanced on your right? Asked Mr. Battlecar.
I think so.
Said Passepartout, and he proceeded to demonstrate his skill.
You are hired!
Exclaimed Mr. Battlecar. Passepartout practiced with the long noses. The performers wore costumes from the Middle Ages, and each man had a splendid pair of wings on his shoulders and a very long nose attached to his face. The noses were made of bamboo, and some were 10 feet long. Passepartout was a little embarrassed to be in a circus act again. It reminded him too much of his youth. But he cheered up, remembering his long nose was helping him to earn money for food. He went on stage and took his place with the rest of the performers. They balanced chairs, balls, and plates on the ends of their long noses. Some climbed up to stand on their fellow performers' noses, performing handstands and acrobatic flips. The theater was full, and the audience was delighted by the spectacle. The grand finale was a feat called the Great Pyramid. A group of acrobats lay on the floor with their noses pointed at the ceiling. A second group lay on the tips of the noses, and a third group climbed up on the noses of the second group. A fourth group did the same, and a towering human pyramid was formed. There was loud applause, and the orchestra began its fanfare when the pyramid began to tip from side to side. One of the lower noses had vanished. The pyramid tilted, tumbled, and collapsed like a house of cards. The missing performer was Passepartout.
Master!
He cried as he jumped into the crowd and fell at the feet of one of the spectators. Mr. Fogg and Aouda, who were seated in the audience, were shocked, as if they had been struck by lightning. Passepartout was kneeling before them in his performer's costume. "Passepartout! We are so happy to find you!" cried Aouda. Mr. Battlecar was furious. He demanded compensation for his ruined show, and Mr. Fogg happily appeased him with a handful of banknotes. The three traveling companions left the theater, together once again. As they made their way through the streets of Yokohama, Aouda explained to Passepartout how they had finally found him. "We reached Yokohama on the morning of November 14th, she said, "and Mr. Fogg immediately went on board the Carnatic, which was still docked in the harbor. He learned to our delight that you had been on board."
Yes. Luckily, I did not miss the steamer,
said Passepartout. "So we knew that you had arrived only the day before," Aouda continued. "We visited the French and English consuls, but they had received no word of you. After wandering through the streets, we began to despair. Chance led us to Mr. Battlecar's theater. We did not recognize you in your costume, but fortunately, you saw us."
You cannot imagine, madam, how happy I am to be back with you,
said Passepartout, smiling widely. He turned to Mr. Fogg with a serious face.
"Sir, please forgive my poor behavior,"
he said.
"It was because of me that you missed the Carnatic. I beg your forgiveness. I was drunk and did not tell you of the schedule change. It will never happen again. Please believe me."
"You are forgiven,"
said Mr. Fogg.
"We will talk no more about it."
They walked on in silence. Passepartout was relieved to be back with his master. Aouda was very happy to see her friend once again. Mr. Fogg was his usual self, as calm and distant as ever. Passepartout then realized that, although Mr. Fogg and Aouda had missed the Carnatic, somehow they had arrived in Yokohama only one day after him. He turned to Aouda for an explanation. She described their search for a boat in the port at Hong Kong and the perilous voyage they had survived. Aouda then explained what had happened at Shanghai. The Yokohama steamer was already underway as they approached the harbor. At Mr. Fogg's request, the Tankadier signaled the steamer with its whistle. The captain of the steamer heard the signal and saw the Tankadier's flag at half-mast, which indicates a ship in distress. Mr. Fogg had arranged this. The steamer directed its course to the little boat. Phileas Fogg quickly paid Captain Bunsby their agreed price, rewarding him with an additional £550. The steamer let down a ladder, and Mr. Fogg and Aouda climbed aboard, followed by Mr. Fix. Mr. Fogg listened politely as Aouda spoke, without adding a word of his own. She finished her story as they reached the steamer, which was now docked in Yokohama Harbor and bound for San Francisco. Mr. Fogg then gave Passepartout the necessary funds to buy clothes that better suited his position. Within an hour, Passepartout had cut off his long nose, parted with his wings, and looked like his master's servant once more. The steamer bound for America was called the General Grant and would take 12 days to cross the Pacific. Phileas Fogg was hoping they would reach San Francisco by December 2nd, New York by December 11th, and London, England by December 20th. According to the wager, his trip was to conclude by December 21st. Mr. Fogg's young female companion, Aouda, felt herself growing attached to her protector. Mr. Fogg's silent but generous nature impressed her. The more time she spent with him, the more she began to feel emotions stronger than simple gratitude. Her new feelings, however, did not seem to have any effect on Mr. Fogg. Passepartout did not fail to notice the state of the lady's heart. She was now as impatient as Fogg was over any delay in their journey. He assured her that the most difficult part of the journey had already passed. A railway train from San Francisco to New York and a steamer from New York to Liverpool would bring them to the end of their incredible travels. Now that Fix was out of their way, no obstacles could slow their progress. At least that's what Passepartout thought. Detective Fix, however, was also on the General Grant, and he had the warrant for Mr. Fogg's arrest in his hand. It had been waiting for him at the English consulate in Yokohama. Unfortunately, now that Fogg had left English territory, it was useless. Fogg could not be arrested outside English territories. 6 days out of Yokohama, Passepartout came face to face with Fix on the forward deck. Without a word, Passepartout grabbed Fix by the throat and began to punch him, to the amusement of a group of Americans close by. When Passepartout had finished, Fix stood up and looked at his adversary coldly.
"Are you done?"
he asked.
For now, yes,
said Passepartout with satisfaction.
"Then let me have a word with you,"
said Fix.
"You have given me a thrashing, and I expected it. Up to this time I have been Mr. Fogg's adversary, but now I am on his side."
Aha!
cried Passepartout.
You are convinced he is an honest man.
"No,"
replied Fix.
"I think he is a rascal. As long as Mr. Fogg was on English ground, it was my duty to detain him until the warrant for his arrest arrived. But now I want him back on English soil as quickly as possible, and I'll do what I can to help him reach it. Are we friends?"
Friends? No.
replied Passepartout.
But allies, perhaps.
On December 2nd, the General Grant reached San Francisco. Mr. Fogg had neither gained nor lost a single day.
Wow! They reached San Francisco. Could Fix arrest Mr. Fogg now? What is the adventure that will happen with them after that? Stay with us to continue the exciting events next episode. Episode 8. You will find a worksheet in the description box. I hope you enjoy. Thank you for watching and see you next video.